Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a night of spine-tingling terror. Tonight, we journey deep into the heart of the wilderness to share some of the most horrifying camping tales ever told. Prepare yourself for a night of fear and suspense as we uncover the dark secrets lurking in the shadows. So pitch your tents, gather close, and let the nightmares begin. I was dog-sitting for a family friend who preferred to have someone stay at their house with the dogs. Having grown up in a rural town, I loved the countryside, so staying here felt like a much-needed break from city life where I rarely had time to myself. The house was truly in the middle of nowhere, about a 2-hour commute from work and a 45-minute drive to the nearest town or interstate. The nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away, directly across the street. Back home, such isolation meant space and safety. But here, this neighbor made me feel anything but safe. When I arrived at Terry and John's house, they briefed me on the routine, feeding their adorable and pampered Australian cattle dogs, watering the plants, and other chores. As we loaded their belongings into their car, Terry casually mentioned, "Oh, don't forget to watch out for Steve." John chimed in, "Yeah? Don't worry about the neighbor across the street. He's harmless, a heavy drinker and a bit odd. But harmless. He's lost his license so many times. All he has is his moped to get around. Two, just in case," Terry added, showing me where they kept their firearm. "Steve has 3 Don't Tread on Me Confederate flags and 2 plain Confederate flags hanging from his porch. He's a bit eccentric." Despite their reassurances, I was cautious. I knew how to handle myself around drunk oddballs, and with 2 protective dogs trained to act on a single command, I felt relatively safe. Terry and John left around 3 p.m. I took the dogs for a walk, played frisbee with them until they were tired, and started unloading my things. Since I was staying for a week, I brought work clothes and my Xbox for entertainment in the evenings. Later that day, around 6 p.m., I heard Steve loudly slamming his door, seemingly in a heated phone conversation. Initially just a faint voice. He began yelling, asking where Terry and John had gone. The dogs, hearing him, started growling softly. "Calm down," I told them reassuringly. "It's okay. Steve probably just wants some privacy. Let's head inside." 2. As I gathered my belongings for another trip, I heard him yell, "I do care about my kids." Then, something hit the unpaved road behind me. I turned to see it was his cell phone. The dogs reacted by going into a frenzy, barking and snarling. I dropped what I was carrying and turned to find Steve at the end of the driveway, staring at me intently. I gave him a friendly wave, but inside, I felt uneasy. "This is weird," I thought, attributing it to his likely intoxication. They had said he was harmless, and I'd dealt with eccentric neighbors before without incident. Steve took a step toward me and spoke in a strangely manipulative tone. "You all right?" "Yeah, I'm fine," I replied, trying to keep calm. "I'm Pippa, just dog-sitting for Johnny and Terry this week, getting the dogs settled in for the night." I glanced at the dogs. They looked ready to pounce, a reaction I hadn't seen from them before. "How about you?" I asked cautiously. We stood in silence for about 30 seconds before he repeated, "I'm asking if you're all right. I'm Steve. Nice to meet you." "Thanks for checking in." "Steve," I said politely, trying to signal the conversation's end. "But like I said, I'm good. Have a good night." "Yeah, all right," he muttered. The silence stretched awkwardly for what felt like a minute. "I'm going inside now," I said finally, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. "Thanks, Steve." 2. I hurried inside, and the dogs followed without issue. Steve lingered at the end of the driveway for 10 minutes, just staring at the house. The property lacked a front door. Instead, there were only side and back doors concealed by dense green privacy trees. To see them, one had to step onto the property, making it impossible to observe either door from the street. As dusk settled around 6 p.m., I settled on the couch with my gaming headset, enjoying some online play. Suddenly, the dogs went berserk, racing towards the back door and barking furiously. Bewildered, I grabbed my nearby knife and cautiously approached the door. Peering out, I saw the telltale glow of Steve's moped in the driveway, obscured by my car. He seemed to be ducking down behind it. The dogs continued growling, but at least they weren't giving away my position. I watched silently as Steve hovered near my car, peering inside as if looking for something. In my hometown, I never locked doors, but here in the city, I kept everything secured. I couldn't tell if he was trying to break in, but he circled the car several times, no longer bothering to crouch. He seemed unaware of being watched or simply didn't care, stopping intermittently to peer inside my car and then back at the house. Nervously, I texted Terry about Steve's unsettling behavior, explaining how uncomfortable I felt. Her response urged me to call the cops if I felt unsafe, noting that they were familiar with him. She even shared a disturbing anecdote about him standing outside at 6 a.m., once suggesting he might have had a psychotic episode. I tried to reassure myself that Steve was just drunk and harmless. However, when he made a second round inspecting my car, I decided it was time to call the police. It was now 8:15 p.m., and the dogs were on high alert, positioned defensively beside me. I called 911 and explained the situation, emphasizing that Terry and John suspected he might be unstable. Halfway through my explanation, the operator interrupted. "Ma'am, what's your address again?" Confused, I repeated my location. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she responded, "but you're not in our county. I'll have to transfer you to the correct jurisdiction." Frustrated, I was transferred again. When the new operator answered, I urgently detailed Steve's actions and how I feared for my safety. She advised me to stay calm, turn on all the lights, and stay inside. Reluctantly, I complied, though I suspected Steve was waiting for any sign of movement. I informed the operator that I had a firearm and would use it if he entered. Relieved, I watched as Steve noticed the lights and promptly retreated on his moped back to his house. I updated the operator, who asked if I still wanted an officer to come out. "Absolutely," I replied firmly. "This is the third time he's come onto the property, and I'm genuinely afraid. Please send someone as soon as possible." She assured me an officer was on the way but needed to be available for other calls. She advised me to call back immediately if Steve returned and I felt threatened. By now, it was 9 broad p.m., and the sun had set completely. The dogs were still on edge, and I was exhausted from patrolling the house with my loaded firearm. Peering out the kitchen window, I spotted Steve's moped but no sign of him. Unable to see the back door from the kitchen, I went upstairs with one dog following closely. The other was too old to climb stairs. From the upstairs window, I watched in alarm as Steve lit matches on the back porch, tossing them onto the wooden deck. His demeanor had changed. He muttered to himself and jerked his head back and forth, unsettlingly animated. I filmed him discreetly, preparing evidence just in case. As darkness fell, he approached the door, knocking and then pounding loudly. Despite my racing heart, I remained composed. If he broke in, I would have no choice but to use my firearm. His eyes glinted with malice as he suddenly stopped pounding, abruptly turned, and raced to his moped, speeding away faster than I thought possible. Moments later, the cop arrived, having just missed Steve on the road. I briefed him on Steve's erratic behavior, emphasizing his possible intoxication or instability. The officer seemed nonchalant, asking if I planned to stay the night. "No," I replied firmly. "I'll leave the dogs here overnight and return in the morning." I asked him to stay while I packed up, which he agreed to. After giving the dogs affection and treats, I crated them for the night and departed. The next day, I returned with my dad, hoping his presence would deter Steve. Sure enough, while watching from the front window, I saw Steve standing at the driveway's end, holding a case of Budweiser, dressed in the same dirty outfit and hat. As my dad approached from the yard's other end, Steve abruptly turned and retreated to his house. Later, I learned about Steve's troubled history, multiple arrests for domestic violence, estranged from his children due to his violent nature, owning a four-wheeler with questionable income sources. Terry and John had never seen him leave for work. His only outings were on his moped, returning hours later with beer. Each time he glanced in my direction, I sensed pure malice. Who knew what might have happened had I not called the cops when I did? From now on, if a neighbor says hi, my response will be a firm, "Let's not meet." I've had encounters with cougars at an old farmhouse we lived in for a while. You could always tell when one was nearby because the nightlife would fall silent, the bats would disappear, the foxes would go quiet, and even the tree frogs and crickets would stop their chirping. It would start with nearby cows acting up, and then it was like a blanket of silence as everything hid from the big cat. Now, here's a creepier story. The same thing happened when a big feral hog was wandering solo at night. In the same place, we would let our dogs run loose at night for exercise. Sometimes, they came home with a raccoon or an armadillo. But one particular night, they came home at full speed, racing to the back porch. My dogs fear nothing because they're tough, so when they run from something, I know it's bad and I head inside for a handgun. With my wife behind me and our dogs scouting ahead, we followed the dogs barking. However, they weren't barking at something ahead. The threat was stuck under the chain link fence. This pig was massive, the size of a baseboat. It grunted, and my old dog charged off the porch. I told my wife to head back to the house, and I'd be there soon. The hog had uprooted the concrete set posts and was staring me down. I backed away, one step at a time, knowing if I tripped, it would have devoured me like I would devour ham. When I reached the porch, my wife had my weapon ready, but the pig was already long gone. The next day, I went to assess the damage to the fence. The only sign of the hog was some bristles and a trashed fence. My parents ran a business with cabins in the middle of nowhere. People would rent them for short stays, and it was my parents' job to clean and prepare them for the next guests. The nearest town was a 40-minute drive away, making daily commutes for school and groceries quite lengthy. But my parents loved the isolation. I was an only child because my parents were too busy with the business to consider having more children, which I now understand as a parent myself. Growing up in this remote area fostered my love for nature. With my parents often preoccupied, they allowed me to explore on my own with a few simple rules. Don't come back too late, usually before sundown for dinner, and a few other minor guidelines. I had a favorite part of the forest where I made my own trail, worn down by my footsteps. It was my private sanctuary, a place of peace and tranquility. My parents knew about it but rarely visited unless they needed to find me urgently. One summer day, I headed down my trail to build a little den from sticks. At 12 years old, I wasn't a master builder, but I enjoyed the challenge of gathering materials to create a makeshift shelter where I could read, listen to music, or simply enjoy the sounds of nature. I was lounging on my lawn chair in the middle of nowhere when I heard rustling on my trail. I looked up to see a fat, bearded man, very tall, stumbling through the trail. He let out a sharp cry of pain as he pricked himself on one of the brambles. My path was ideal for someone my height, but for a taller person, it was a bit uncomfortable. As he approached, he asked me what I was doing there, with a tone that made him sound like the owner of the woods. Unsure if the land had an owner or if it was just public property, I started to get scared, fearing I might not be allowed there anymore. I asked who he was, and he claimed to own that part of the forest. He looked me up and down and asked again what I was doing. I apologized and explained that I just liked coming there, not wanting him to think I was causing any harm by building a den on his property. He looked at the bundle of sticks and asked what I was trying to do. When I explained I was building a little den, he laughed, and the conversation became more lighthearted. He said he used to build dens in the forest when he was younger. I asked if I could continue building mine, and he nodded, saying it would be okay. But then things took a creepy turn. He suggested, "How about you let me play with you now and then? And you can keep coming back to your den with no problem." I didn't fully understand what he meant and assumed he meant building the den together. I shyly nodded, but a surge of fear shot through me. His eyes had a hungry, predator-like look, and he moved closer, saying he really enjoyed playing with little girls. At that moment, my heart stopped, and I knew I needed to leave. Without another word, I bolted, abandoning my lawn chair and other belongings, and ran back home as fast as I could. The usual 15-15-minute journey took me only 7 minutes. I burst through the door, babbling to my mom. She calmed me down after about 10 minutes, and I finally asked if the forest belonged to anyone. She said it was part of the cabin site and that anyone could go through it since my parents owned it. Relieved, I asked who the man was who claimed to own the woods. My mom looked confused and asked me to describe him. When I did, down to the dirty green plaid shirt, she got a strange look on her face and walked away, saying she'd be right back. She fetched my dad, who was cleaning one of the properties. After a conversation, they both returned, and my dad asked me to confirm if it was the man I'd seen. When I said it was, they told me not to worry and smiled, ending the discussion. I never saw the man again, and I was grateful for that, but I always wondered who he was. I was too scared to go back into the forest for about 2 years. When I finally returned, I had to remake my trail. As I grew older, my interest shifted towards hanging out with friends, but I still used the trail occasionally. Years later, while hanging out with friends at that spot, we shared scary stories. I recounted my experience with the creep. My friends were shocked and asked for a description. One friend seemed to recognize him and did some research online. The next day, she showed me a picture of a man who turned out to be a convicted predator who had stalked our area years ago. He had been found guilty of a terrible crime involving a young child and was sent to prison. Realizing how close I had come to danger was terrifying. I'd rather not meet him again. Hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed tonight's spine-chilling camping tales. Your support means the world, and I can't wait to bring you more heart-pounding horror stories soon. Stay safe, stay curious, and until next time, keep the campfire burning. Like and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe the channel.